edición de On-Off, Conversaciones en Libro. En esta ocasión vamos a tener una invitada de lujo, de prestigio mundial, lo cual representa un honor y un privilegio para todos nosotros. Quisiera agradecer a Applebaum por estar aquí con nosotros hoy. La profesora Applebaum es columnista del Washington Post y el Atlantic Monthly, es académica del London School of Economics y de la Universidad Johns Hopkins en Washington, D.C. También es autora de varios libros, todos los cuales están traducidos al español, sobre la historia de Europa Oriental y Europa Central durante el siglo XX. Gulag, que es un libro que ganó el premio Pulitzer en Estados Unidos, El telón de acero y Hambruna roja, y recientemente ha publicado El ocaso de la democracia. Professor Applebaum, thanks for being here with us today. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm sure this conversation will help us to illuminate on several very interesting current issues.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you.
Let me start with the war between Russia and Ukraine. From an historian point of view, do you think that this war was inevitable? With the perspective of history, wasn't it obvious that a power such as Russia would never accept a Ukraine that leans to the West?
No, I don't think it was inevitable. I don't think anything is ever inevitable. I think a different kind of government in Russia would never have launched this war. This is really, in many ways, a war that's very personal to Putin, to the president of Russia, and also to the specific nature of the regime that he's created over the last 20 years. This is a regime that is simultaneously very strong and very fragile. They control all aspects of Russian society. They control the media. They control the economy. They literally own the economy. But at the same time, they are aware of their illegitimacy. They're afraid of street revolutions. They lock up dissidents. They don't trust their own strength. And so they're very sensitive in particular to any language about democracy, any language that could attract Russians. They try to destroy any appeal that the idea of Europe or the idea of democratic sovereignty would have. For the Russians, for the Russian leadership, Ukraine is a problem not just because it's a former territory of the Russian Empire, which of course it is, or a former colony, but also because it's a symbol of a country that has sought to break away firstly from the Soviet Union, and then later from this post-Soviet kleptocratic form of government that Putin encapsulates. And, most famously, they're aware that there was a major street revolution in Ukraine in 2014 that involved lots of young people waving democracy banners and anti-corruption banners and European flags. And they're afraid of the example that Ukraine could set for Russians. I mean, they see Ukraine not just as a territory to conquer, but also as a kind of ideological enemy. It represents a kind of society that they're afraid could challenge theirs. And so I think really that's what the war is about. It's about the Russian leader trying to eliminate an ideological rival. And no, that was not inevitable. It didn't have to happen. And a different Russian leader would have come to different conclusions, I think.
You mentioned Putin. How do you understand Vladimir Putin? Is he an accident of history, a rare case that surely will not repeat itself in the future and fade away? Or is he the incarnation of an ever-present trend in Russia's tradition of nationalism, imperialism, and authoritarianism?
Well, as I said, I don't believe that countries are incapable of change. Countries do change. They become different. The world is full of imperial nations that are no longer empires. I'm in London right now, and here in Britain, there is no longer a British Empire, and nobody really wants it. Nobody would want it back. And so you can have changes in the nature of countries and nations. So in that sense, what Putin really is a continuation of the Soviet era. He's somebody who was trained in the KGB, which saw itself as the vanguard of the Soviet Union and the most important institution there, which it was. And he grew up thinking of himself as a part of that Soviet empire. Remember that he spent many years in the 1980s in East Germany, back when Berlin was a part of the Soviet empire. So he thinks of all of Eastern Europe, and I think actually up into and including Berlin, as somehow natural territory for Russian influence and domination. And so in that sense, he's a continuation of the Soviet vision of the world, and he's really made no secret of that. Actually, Russian troops that are coming into Ukraine right now are often putting up Soviet flags and using Soviet symbols, because the Russian nation itself doesn't stand for much, or it doesn't stand for much that's appealing to Ukrainians, certainly. And so they're trying to use this Soviet symbolism instead. But I don't think that's inevitable. I can imagine a different kind of leader of Russia who would really want to break away from the Soviet tradition and the imperial tradition that's actually been so damaging to Russia and to the Russian people.
President Putin wrote an essay last year, and where he said that there is no such thing as a Ukrainian nation, that Ukraine is a kind of an invention of the West to weaken Russia and to frustrate Moscow's ambitions as a superpower. However, we have seen and we continue to witness a strong Ukrainian resistance against the Russian invasion since February. Has this reaction of the Ukrainians been a surprise to you?
No, of course I'm not surprised by it. I wrote, one of my books was about partly about the history of Ukraine. It was about the history of the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s. Ukraine is a region that's had a consciousness of itself for several hundred years. They define themselves as Ukrainian. Sometimes they use the name Rushini. They've used different names historically, but both when they were part of the Polish Empire and then later when they were part of the Russian Empire, they've thought of themselves as different from people in Moscow, and actually people in Moscow have always thought of them as different too. They made one major attempt to become independent in 1918 at the time of the Russian Revolution. That was a moment when a lot of nations that had been part of bigger European empires did become independent, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states. It was a moment when nations emerged from empires all across Europe, and unfortunately Ukraine at that moment failed for a variety of reasons. One, because it was attacked by both the Bolsheviks and the White Russian, the Imperial Russian armies, who couldn't envision an alliance with Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why they lost. And so it had its own identity when it was inside the Soviet Union, and Stalin knew that it was a different place too. And I've read many documents of Stalin describing his fear of Ukraine, his fear of Ukrainian revolution, his dislike of Ukraine. And then, of course, there were a number of moments in Soviet history where there were policies directed at Ukraine designed to suppress Ukrainians, to destroy Ukrainian intellectuals, the Ukrainian leadership, even the Ukrainian Communist Party, and famously Ukrainian peasants. Some 4 million of them died in an artificially created famine between the years 1932 and 1934. So it's been a state for a long time. It revived. It created the Ukrainian national movement in the late 1980s, led to the independence of Ukraine in 1991, and actually it was really independent Ukraine that helped bring down the Soviet Union. I think without that, the Soviet system might have lasted a lot longer. So not only is it a real place with a real identity, and one that wants to see itself and thinks of itself as having a very different political system than that which now exists in Russia, it's prepared to fight for it, and it has done before. And so, no, I wasn't surprised at all. And I think most people who knew Ukraine well were also not surprised. Remember that most of the analysts who were looking at this war from Washington and also from Moscow were reading Russian military documents and Russian military doctrine, and they weren't paying a lot of attention to Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And that was, of course, a mistake because it led to a lot of mistaken policies at the beginning of this war.
How do you evaluate the West's reaction to Russia's aggression against Ukraine? How do you evaluate it? The West's reaction.
It's much more consistent and shows greater solidarity than many expected. I think in particular since Putin expected. I think Putin is a close observer of Western division. He pays a lot of attention to the far right press, both in Europe and in America, and I think he believes that version of history and that version of popular events. And so he thinks of the West as very weak and divided and sort of dominated by arguments. And of course, it is divided and dominated by arguments, but especially the United States right now. But it is nevertheless possible to unify and to organize many Western nations around similar ideas. And so, yes, there has been a support both for sanctions, quite serious sanctions, and for a military operation. I don't know whether the support will last forever. The difficulty, I think, for the West and for analysts of this war is that, and I'm not sure people have really understood this yet, that until there is some kind of Ukrainian victory, in other words, until the Russians are convinced that they can't win, the war is not over. And so people who imagine that there can be some kind of deal, there can be swapping land for peace or something like that, as there was in 2014, I think are making a mistake. I don't think that will end the war. And so Europe is in a very difficult position. It's an ugly war. Nobody wants to be fighting it. No one wants the Ukrainians to suffer. The economic price that everybody is paying, including the whole world is going to pay, is going to be very high. And I should stress that this price is being it's being evoked deliberately by Russia. So Russia is deliberately blocking Ukrainian grain exports because it wants to raise food prices, not just in Europe, but around the world. It's hoping to create economic crisis. It wants to create famine. It wants to create hardship in Africa and the Middle East and countries where normally Ukrainian grain exports would go to, because that's part of the strategy. The strategy is to undermine Europe, undermine the United States, and undermine the world system, the international system more broadly, and to show that it doesn't function. And so it's a very dangerous, very, very ugly war. I see why people would like it to be over. I'm just afraid that it's not going to be that easy to bring it to an end.
Is it enough to send weapons and to sanction Russia's leadership and economy? Isn't that a policy that will end up prolonging the war and containing Russia through the effort, the suffering, and even the blood of the Ukrainian people?
So it depends what you mean by prolonging the war. If Ukraine stops fighting, then Russia will occupy Ukraine. And first of all, Ukraine will cease to exist as an independent country. Secondly, we know already what Russia does when it occupies Ukrainian territory. So it uses random violence against civilians. It puts tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people into concentration camps. It deports them to Russia. It uses random violence against people. But also specific targeted violence against leaders, mayors of cities, police chiefs, anybody who has a position of authority in any community. There are records of them attacking and arresting and probably killing directors of museums and schools. There will be all over Ukraine a bloodbath of a kind that we have not seen in Europe, or maybe anywhere actually, since the Second World War. And so it's not that the violence would stop if the war ends. The violence will get much worse. And it will extend all over Ukraine and the sovereign Ukrainian territories. It's very possible that the destruction of Ukrainian agriculture will continue, famine will get worse, the economic situation will get worse. So I'm not sure why people imagine that an end to the war will bring some kind of peace, especially to Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting to prevent that from happening. They're fighting to maintain some kind of civilization in their territory. So asking them to not fight in order that they can all be murdered is it's very difficult. I mean, ask yourselves whether you would, whether given the choice between fighting or being conquered by a country that wants to commit mass murder on your territory, which is better?
Yeah, my question is directed not about the Ukrainian people, which of course must defend their own sovereignty, but for the West. Aren't they fighting a proxy war using the Ukrainians and then containing Russia, which for a while has been a threat for the rest of Europe and even for the West?
So, my view is that Russia has been a threat for a decade. Russia was a threat when it invaded Ukraine in 2014. We bought a few years of peace by trading Crimea and de facto trading parts of eastern Ukraine to Russia. That did not satisfy Russia because, as I said, Russia's main problem with Ukraine and more broadly with Europe is ideological. And so doing that again doesn't solve the problem. If you give Ukraine to Russia and you let them commit these acts of mass murder and genocide, what you will do is create a Russia whose next goal will be Poland or the Baltic states or Germany. I mean, it's my strong belief that Putin still continues to see Berlin as a natural part of some kind of Soviet sphere of influence as well. So you haven't ended the problem, you haven't solved it, you haven't ended the war. There is a different argument. In this sense, I agree with you. There's a different argument that says the West is not doing enough, and that we are spooning out a little bit of help to the Ukrainians. We've given them some weapons. We haven't given them so far our best weapons or our most sophisticated weapons, and we're dragging out the war and making it last longer than it could. I mean, with greater Western engagement, then we could have the war be over more quickly. And that might be more humane. I mean, if we could push Russian troops back to the border faster, by the end of the summer, or, then you would have a situation where fewer people would die. And then you would have a faster return to some kind of normal commerce and diplomacy in Europe. There's an argument that says that the longer the war lasts, the more damaging it is for everybody. And I agree with that.
Your book, The Iron Curtain, you describe the birth of the Cold War in Europe after the Second World War. Do you think, or do you see a new Cold War emerging in Europe between Russia and the West?
I mean, I don't think that history really repeats itself in that way. This is not like the Cold War. We have a different relationship with Russia than we once had with the Soviet Union. There isn't an international ideological bloc of the kind there was in the 1950s or 1960s. Russia is it's true, of a kind of web of autocracies who do help one another. Russia has some backing from China. It itself is a backer of Venezuela and of Cuba, so there are links between autocracies around the world, but it's not a solid ideological bloc. But are we returning to a moment when Russia poses, at least as long as it's under the current regime, when Russia poses a permanent military threat to Europe and maybe to other places too? Yes, it does now. It poses a military threat to Europe, to the Middle East. Russia has a role in Syria. Russia is clearly willing to use military force, maybe in other places. As I said, they have deep links with the Venezuelan regime. They have deep links to the Cuban regime, and their goal to destroy international institutions, international norms, rules about borders and behavior. All of that could have spillover effects in the rest of the world, and I think it's time that everybody acknowledged that and understood it.
However, there is a similarity with Cold War, which is that Russia has a large nuclear arsenal. And that is part of the equation that cannot be obviated. What do you think about that? Would the Russians, is just a threat, or would the Russians really use some kind of limited nuclear power in a war like we are witnessing now?
So there's no question that the reason why Western support for Ukraine has been so slow and so measured is because of the threat of nuclear weapons. So everybody's thinking about that all the time. They're thinking about it in Washington. They think about it in Berlin, they think about it in Brussels, they think about it in London. It's part of the equation. It's part of why many European leaders continue to speak to Putin. You know, Macron calls Putin periodically. Others try and speak to their counterparts also in Russia. You know, further down, the U.S. military tries constantly to keep in touch with the Russian military, and that's why. I was very worried about the Russian use of nuclear weapons at the beginning of the war, in the first part of it. But when the Russian army withdrew from the territory north of Kiev, then it became clear to me that actually there are rational military calculations being made, and Putin is not crazy, and his generals are not crazy. And I don't see how they could justify the use of a nuclear weapon in a way that it wouldn't have any military significance. In other words, it wouldn't make the Ukrainians surrender. But it would immediately wreck all of Russia's relationships, with China, with India, and with other countries. And I just don't think that's a price that the Russians are willing to pay yet. I should also say that the U.S. military watches Russian nuclear facilities very closely and doesn't see any sign of anybody getting ready to use a nuclear weapon. It's true that they talk about it, in their propaganda on television. And I think that's part of that is to force this slowdown in Western aid for Ukraine, and to scare people. I mean, I think they're certainly doing that, and they've done it quite successfully. But I don't see right now that this is something they really feel they would be able to get away with. And by the way, there isn't really any such thing as limited nuclear use. I mean, there are smaller nuclear weapons, so-called tactical weapons, and they're about the same size as the bombs that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. So they're still unbelievably devastating, and they would have a huge impact on Europe and everywhere else. And they would be, it's not like a small thing that no one's noticing. It would be a major change, and it would be also a break in, a break with norms and accepted practice that's existed since 1945.
Let me change the subject and talk about your most recent book, The Twilight of Democracy. This is a book that deals with developments that you witnessed and suffered even personally, and that you wrote on many topics that you wrote in your columns and articles, but not on previous books. This is a different book from the rest of which I have seen written by you. What led you to write it?
What led me to write it is the series of events that I described in the book. I had this experience of watching political polarization divide my friends and divide people that I knew. And not only that, I had this experience in 3 countries. I grew up in the United States. I've lived a lot of my life in Poland, where my husband is a politician. And I've also spent a lot of time in England, where I worked in the media for a long time. So this experience of watching people divide, and watching people stop speaking to each other, and watching the political pendulum move is simply one that I had. And I also realized that it was something that was pretty universal, and it was happening in other places. And so I thought it was worth describing both what I saw and also using some reporting that I've done in other places where I've been, where I'd observed much of the same practice. And it's funny, I've had a reaction to the book, even from Latin America and from other places around the world, of people saying, "Oh, that describes my country too." So I think it's something that we can all recognize.
As you mentioned in your book, democracy seems to be in retreat in many places. What is the problem with democracy nowadays?
That's what the book is about, and it's a long answer. I think that there's one really important part of the answer, which is that the nature of social media and the nature of modern economics, as well as demographics and sociology, means that we're now living through this period of unbelievably rapid change, and in which we are living, we have new information all the time, all day long, every day. We're living through massive social change, the impact of feminism and gay rights, in many countries, the impact of immigration, people moving much more easily from town to city and around the world and back again. All of those things have created in many countries a kind of nostalgia for something simpler and something more unified, and this longing for unity, a longing for a single authority or a single set of ideas has become very powerful. And democracy by definition involves this constant clash of ideas and constant debate. And when the debate becomes a debate about the actual nature of the country, you can get a situation where political parties no longer see themselves as rivals over policy, but rivals over the national self-definition of who are we as a country. And this can become very dangerous as people begin to see one another not as rivals, but as real enemies, or, we're the patriots, they're the traitors. And this kind of politics has become dominant in a lot of places in the United States, to some degree in Britain, to some degree in Poland. Look at the recent election in Colombia, where you have these very extreme candidates who seem to belong to very different worlds competing with one another in a contest that we would have thought not possible just a few years ago. That's actually very typical now in many countries.
Let me take you to some questions from the audience. Felipe Bamontes asks, how much will this war make Russia and China to become closer? And how would this issue affect the Western world?
That is a very hard question to answer. It's clear that before the war started, that Russia had China's backing. There was a statement issued by Putin and Xi Jinping just before the Olympics about solidarity and so on, and that was clearly preparation for the war. It's one of the reasons I thought the war was going to happen. I think that the Chinese have been put off both by the Russian military failure in the first part of the war and by the degree of brutality that the Russians have used. And they may also be worried about the impact on global food supply and grain, which isn't good for them and for countries that they have involvement in around the world as well. And more recently, they've been more circumspect about saying they support Russia. They have some of their companies have observed some of the sanctions, and they've stayed relatively silent. I mean, they've backed Russia a little bit at the UN and in some other fora, but they haven't backed them very loudly. And they say, at least right now, that they're not giving Russia any weapons. So I think China is waiting to see what happens. It's a moment when they are, I think they also didn't expect the Western response of the kind that it got. I think they didn't expect the Western military response. I don't think they want a major war with the West, either a military war or any other kind of major conflict right now. They're having some problems of their own. And so they may just wait and see. I don't think you can, based on what we know now about China's support for Russia, I don't think you can make any long-term predictions. Their initial support seems to have faded. What conclusions they draw will depend on how the war ends. I mean, I think if it ends with a sovereign Ukraine, with defendable borders and some kind of Western guarantee, then I think they'll support that outcome. But we'll see.
One last question from the audience. Jaime Herrera asks, do you think there is a possibility of some kind of internal rebellion against Putin? Would that be the way to end the war?
So yes, that would be the way to end the war. But I don't see any reason to predict it. From what we know, Putin is very, very well guarded. He doesn't have much interaction with anybody, and hasn't done for a couple of years because of COVID, and maybe because of some other illnesses he has. We don't know the answer. I can't confirm that at all. Of course, there are many rumors. And it doesn't look to me right now like there's a mechanism through which he could be changed, in which power could be changed. I mean, it's pretty clear that there is a lot of disaffection and unhappiness in the Russian elite, especially the business elite, and maybe even the security elite. There are some leading members of the FSB, which is their internal police, have been arrested. And so there's some kind of dissatisfaction, but I don't know what the method is, how that you would channel that dissatisfaction into a change of leader. So the strange thing about Russia right now, is that not only do we not know who will be the next leader of Russia, we don't know how that person will be chosen or who will choose it. It's a country that doesn't really have those kinds of institutions. I mean, there isn't a Politburo like there used to be in the old days. There's no Soviet Communist Party. There isn't a ruling institution like that. There's just the Putin and the Kremlin administration and his personal police force, the people who guard him. So I really can't predict it.
Professor Applebaum, let me thank you very much for this conversation and your time. You've been most kind, and we have all enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very, very glad I could be with you. Hope we'll do it in real life sometime soon.
Hope so.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Y a todos ustedes, muchas gracias por haber compartido con nosotros esta edición de On-Off, Conversaciones en Libero. Ustedes, miembros de la red El Libero, les agradecemos su apoyo, su participación y los dejamos invitados para una próxima edición de Conversaciones On-Off El Libero. Hasta la próxima.
El Libero, la realidad como no la habías visto.
Haz que estos contenidos lleguen más lejos haciéndote miembro de la red Libero.